Historically, deaf children who were of school age attended schools for the deaf. In Atlantic Canada, so Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, the children attended school in Amherst, Nova Scotia. In Quebec, students went to Montreal to the Mackay Institution if they were from English families. If they were from French-speaking families, the girls went to a French Catholic school for deaf girls and the boys to a French Catholic school for deaf boys. And in Ontario, students came from around the province to Belleville to attend the school for the deaf there. And in the prairies, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, the students went to Winnipeg to the Manitoba School for the Deaf. In 1921, BC opened their own school for the deaf in Vancouver, so those students went there, leaving only the students from the prairie provinces to attend in Manitoba. That continued until 1931, when in Saskatoon, the Saskatchewan government built their own new Saskatchewan School for the Deaf for their students. That left only the students from Alberta and Manitoba who continued to attend in Winnipeg. At that time, there was about 175 students. In 1939, Europe was at war. World War II had broken out. The following spring, so in 1940, representatives from the Royal Canadian Air Force, as well as the federal government and Manitoba government, along with the principal from the Manitoba School for the Deaf, or MSD, met up on the third floor of the MSD building, which housed the boys' dormitory. The boys saw people meeting and saw them pointing and gesturing up towards the tower, but they didn't really pay much attention to it. In the summer of 1940, the Manitoba and Saskatchewan government representatives met, and as a result of the Manitoba School for the Deaf closing, they made arrangements for the deaf students from rural Manitoba to attend to the Saskatchewan School for the Deaf. This arrangement was to commence the fall of 1940. The deaf students living in Winnipeg would attend a day program. So those decisions were set in place. At some point later, the Alberta government heard about this arrangement and then approached the Saskatchewan government to see if they had any availability or occupancy, and they were told that Saskatchewan could accommodate 6 students. Alberta then moved on to BC and asked how many they could accommodate, and they said they could take 4. That left 35 deaf children who needed education come the fall. Capacity was found at Mackay Institution in Montreal, and so those 35 students were to attend commencing the fall of 1940. The Northern Alberta Railway serviced points north of Edmonton. The train would go and pick up the deaf students before the school year started and bring them on to Edmonton. There, deaf children of Edmonton would have their parents go and pick up those students at the train station and bring them to their homes overnight. The following morning, all of the students would return to the train station and head south. They would go on to Red Deer, where they picked up more students, and on to Calgary. By then, they had quite a crowd. They then waited for the Canadian Pacific Railway passenger train that was coming from the west. Once the train had arrived, there were 2 additional cars added to the train, one for the deaf girls and one for the deaf boys. The parents would bring their children to the train station to see them off. There's a story of one young girl who showed up carrying a chamber pot. people looked and snickered at the young girl. But the parents met a porter who himself was a black gentleman who was a child of deaf adults and so therefore could sign, and they explained to him that the chamber pot was for their daughter's use overnight and asked if he could take care of making sure she had it under her bed, which he said he would. All of the children got on the train and were getting ready to leave for the school year. Their parents were milling about on the platform to see them off. As the train was ready to depart the station, the bell would ring and the engineer would apply some throttle. Those big, powerful wheels often spun on the rails. Now, it just so happens that above the steam box, there was a sandbox that had pipes running down to the tracks in front of the wheels. And the engineer could release some sand down those pipes onto the tracks for the train to have traction. As the parents were on the platform, they would see their children off. And there was one young child who was inconsolable when they were leaving their parents. An older deaf girl tried to console her. As the train pulled out of the stations, it would be going through the city, passing the houses and the cars and the people. The train would continue to steam along on its route, passing the communication lines that seemed endless, passing the fields, passing the barbed wire fences, seeing people out in the country, passing pastures full of cattle and rural houses. It continued to make its way east. As it bumped along on its journey, the cars jostling one behind the other, the steam pouring out, it continued to roll along. Now, as you know, railway track are put together in sections, and there is a joint between each section that makes that familiar clickety-clack that deaf people could feel. So the train would continue along, bumping on its way. Now, back to the young girl who was inconsolable. The older girl tried to ask her what her name was. The young girl was a bit sheepish and just looked at her. And then the older girl remembered about the name tags in every person's item of clothing when they went to the school for the deaf for laundry purposes. So she looked at the back of her shirt and saw the name and said, "Oh, your name is Liz, L-I-Z." And the little girl just looked at her. And then the older girl said, "Your name is Liz. Sign it with me. L-I-Z." And the little girl went, L-I-Z. And she was complimented by the older girl and asked to repeat it. So again, she spelled L-I-Z. And she, again, after being congratulated, she was quite happy of herself. Now, in that girls' train car, often the girls would get together and show each other all of the new clothing they had for the upcoming school year. And it was quite an exciting time. Now, the children would play games on the passenger trains to pass time. Now, as you know, perhaps, the train cars are structured that they have kind of bench seats too wide on either side of the rail car, but they face the bench seat in front of them, and then that pattern is repeated down the length of the car where two benches face each other, and then the two would be back to back for the other two that faced each other. And the children would hold on to the armrests that were along the aisle and propel themselves as much as they could, just landing on their feet, reaching as far forward and jumping as far down the aisle as they could. And they would go back and forth and had great fun and, of course, got exercises. Some would pass the time reading. Others would play cards. There was one young fellow who borrowed the conductor's hat, and with that conductor's hat on his head, strutted proudly up and down the aisle of the passenger car. He was very pleased with himself. Another game that children played to pass time was what they called the color game. A group of them would get together and each would pick a specific color. One might choose red, one might choose black, and they might decide they're looking for cars. So somebody would see, a black car, and that was their color, so they'd count to one. And somebody would see a red car, and they would count to one. And Pretty soon they were counting how many they could see of their chosen color. Somebody might get up into a great lead, but eventually somebody would be declared the winner. They might have had, say, 5 red cars, and that was the number they had decided. Or they could be looking for houses, but items of a certain color to a predetermined number. Or there could be freight trains that they would meet along the route. The students would get together and make a game out of counting how many cars were on passing freight trains. So they had to count quickly if the trains were moving fast, and eventually the train would get past and the students would try and figure out who had the right number. And so whatever the majority was the winner. Some might have 156, some might have 154, but whatever the majority number was, they would determine to be the correct number of cars. So it was good numeracy and as well good language practice with their counting so quickly. One fellow passed time by looking at the train schedule. Other students got in the habit of asking him, where's the next stop? How long till we're going to be stopped again? And he'd say, next stop might be Brooks, Alberta. And they'd say, well, how long till there? And he'd say, we should be arriving in about 15 minutes. So all along the route, students frequently asked this person what the next stops would be, whether it was Regina, Winnipeg, and how long, all the way to Montreal. And they got to know the names of the Canadian cities. One boy decided to pass some time by going out to the small platform between adjoining rail cars and open the window and stick his head out. And as he stood there with his head sticking out, wind blew through his hair and he looked at the scenery and the communication lines passing by him. As the train went around corners, he could see the locomotive with the steam billowing out. He looked ahead and saw the cars bouncing along. He could see the parallel rails of a siding beside him, the communication lines flowing along. All of a sudden, those parallel lines would join again through a switch back to him. The cars continued to bounce along ahead of him until all of a sudden, he got hit in the cheek by a big green jumper. Now, a green jumper, why, that would be a grasshopper. That grasshopper hit him right in the cheek. His eye was swollen shut, and back to his rail car he went. There's another story of a couple of boys who went into the washroom, and there, of course, there's the white toilet bowl, and in the bottom there's a hole closed by a flapper valve with a little bit of water sloshing about. Now, beside the toilet, there's a pedal, and that push pedal opens the flapper valve and water runs down the sides of the toilet bowl and out onto the tracks. When you open the flapper valve, you can actually see the ties passing by underneath through the toilet hole. Now, one boy saw the toilet paper. This is not current rolls of toilet paper. It's the old rectangle folded interlocking toilet paper. And he would grab a handful and with the pedal down and the water washing down the sides of the bowl, he would fold it all up and try and throw it down to keep it dry and have it blow away in the wind. This was great fun and the two boys took turns doing that. Behind them on a train car was a porter who, as he was walking back and forth on the train car, saw this white stuff billowing away and he wondered what it was and went to investigate. As he got closer, he saw that it was white toilet paper billowing in the wind. And so he opened the bathroom door and caught the two boys red-handed and sent them back to their train car. Of course, they giggled and chuckled all the way back. Now, as mentioned, there were 2 rail cars added, one for the girls and one for the boys. Now, they were given responsibilities while they were on the train, and the girls' responsibility was to serve the meals. The porters would set out the dishes and the girls would serve them. That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They would serve all the girls and boys, and the boys' responsibility was to gather up the dirty dishes and wash them. Now, they would wash the dishes in a big, deep double sink, and they would fill it up with water, and of course, the dishwater would slosh around because the train was moving. And the water would slosh, and the boys would spill it all over the floor, themselves, and their shoes, much to their dismay. Another train would leave Edmonton for points eastbound, and it would go to Lloydminster, which is a town straddling the Alberta and Saskatchewan borders, where it would pick up students. The train would continue on its way over the Saskatchewan border, down through Saskatoon and on to Winnipeg. There, the deaf students would get off and await the students coming on the CPR line from Calgary via Regina and on to Winnipeg. So the students that arrived on the first train would meet representatives from the local deaf community who would talk to them all about the Manitoba School for the Deaf's closing. The students paid rapt attention. When the other train arrived, those students would get on board on their route to Montreal and to the Mackay Institution and tell those deaf students everything they had learned. They would say that they had learned from the local deaf community that the Manitoba School for the Deaf was closed because the Royal Canadian Air Force had taken over the building. Now, because of the tower, the building was perfect for the training of radio operators and wireless communication personnel. In the schoolrooms, the operators could learn their trade, and they could learn how to communicate with pilots, as well as the names of planes and the various munitions that they would encounter in Europe. There, they learned all of what they needed to know. They got to practice their skills. Operators could communicate with pilots as they were practicing flying, and wireless operators could practice their communications with distant places. Because of the tower, communication was clear and unobstructed. The personnel attended the training for 6 weeks before being sent off to the front to the war in Europe. So the Manitoba School for the Deaf was essentially commandeered by the Air Force for training purposes, and the school was closed. Members of the local deaf community lobbied the government very hard, saying that the students needed to be educated, and it was essentially a brand new school that they had. And so they fought long and hard, even involving the Western Canadian Association of the Deaf, to lobby the government. The community lobbied, but essentially understood that it was no choice but for the students to go to Montreal. And so they told the students arriving from the west. And with all the deaf students on board, the train would depart Winnipeg into Ontario, where it would enter the Shield, and the students would see the rocks and the trees and the lakes and pass through the darkened rock-hewn tunnels, see all of the beautiful countryside as the train meandered slowly around all the corners. They would see people fishing, and it was wonderful. Eventually, on the trip, the children would be sent to bed. So they would climb into their berths, and there are lower and upper berths on the train, and be gently rocked to sleep. The students were gently rocked in their berths as the train moved through northern Ontario. In Ontario, the train had lots of curves and had to move slowly. By contrast, coming across the prairie, the train sped very much, and so the children were rocked in their berths back and forth as the train hurtled across the prairies. Especially the students in the upper berths, where the train cars moved more so than those in the lower berths. So the students would be thrown back and forth as the train raced across the prairies, the cars jostling along the tracks, one behind the other in rapid succession as the smoke poured out of the chimney and the train hurtled on its way toward the Shield. In the Shield, the train moved much more slowly and cautiously along the tracks. When the students were asleep, they still knew what was going on. As the train started making lots of noise, they could tell that they were going over a trestle bridge. unsupported, and more noisy. As they could feel the steam being released by the powerful engine, they knew that they were slowing down, eventually coming to a stop. The students remained in their beds, and when the car shook quickly and violently, they knew that they were stopped waiting for a passing freight train, a big heavy freight train that shook their car. Again, they would be still when the freight train had passed. They would feel the steam being applied to those big engine pistons to move those wheels, and they would start on their way again. The train would pull them across the tracks in the dark of night. But when there was a sudden jolt, they knew that they had gone through a switch and onto another set of tracks. As the train began to slow, they would feel the shake in their bed as they stopped and quit moving. They would have no idea where they were in the dark of night, but they would also again feel the engine applying power and taking up the slack in all the rail car couplings as it moved forward again. The train continued to power and move across the Canadian Shield, one car following the next. Now, when the students got up in the morning, they saw what seemed to be brand new shoes by their beds. But upon closer inspection, they realized that they were their own shoes. And that's when they learned that one of the porter's duties was to shine everyone's shoes overnight. So while they slept, they got what seemed to be new shoes. As the train continued on its journey, at times the engineer would look out his window. He would get hit in the face with coal embers as the firemen continued to shovel on the coal, and he would look to make sure that things were going well. He would watch the track, and all of a sudden one time, the engineer heard a terrible racket and slowed the train to a stop, trying to find out what this terrible noise was. He knew there was something wrong, but he didn't know what it was. Ahead, he saw his siding and so brought the train to a stop. One of the trainmen got off, threw the big switch to move the big train onto that siding. The engineer started forward slowly off the rail line he was on onto the siding. Train cars following one after the other till the train was completely off the main line. And then the engineer brought the train to a stop. People were wondering why they were stopped here. The children continued to play, but regardless, they were stopped in the forest on the tracks. So the conductor walked forward and asked the engineer what was wrong. The engineer said, "I don't know, there's a terrible racket as if something has let go. We need to have it fixed. We don't have the tools. I'm sure we're going to need to call some assistance." And the conductor, as was the custom of the day, went over beside the rail line and scampered up a communication pole, tied into the lines, and radioed forward for help. The conductor was successful in radioing ahead and making arrangements for a crew to be sent out to do the repairs, but they would have to wait for the crew and for the repairs. So the people waited in the train cars, which, as it sat parked in the afternoon sun, got hotter and hotter. So they got out and started milling about, visiting, talking, having cigarettes. The children got off and in the middle of the forest continued to play along the train tracks. Looking forward, they saw people huddled having conversations. There was one group, however, that was of military people who were actually Germans, and they could tell that because on their back they had a large prisoner of war or POW crest emblazoned. So they stood there smoking and talking, and the Canadian military guarded them, if you could call it that, as they had no guns. But the deaf students were in awe that there was some prisoners of war from Germany there. One of the German soldiers looked at the deaf students and waved to them. They awkwardly waved back, and more people waved back and forth to each other, and the students were impressed by how friendly the prisoners of war were. The students then decided that they would go up and inspect the engine to see what was wrong. So they came and looked, along with many others, as the train was parked idly on that siding, waiting to continue its journey. And so the students and passengers waited through the day. At one point, the porter said it was time for bed. Some of the deaf children decided, hey, let's have a race, and challenged the porter to a race. So there was 4 boys and the adult porter. Somebody said, on your mark, get set, go! And they all sprinted towards their car at the end of the train. The 4 boys ran for all they were worth, but of course the porter with his long adult legs beat them. 4 boys arrived breathlessly, and all they could remember is the porter laughing and his big white teeth. But the children listened and scampered up and got into their berths for the night. At some point, the repairs were completed and the locomotive built up steam and started on its way again. As it built up power and started moving, the train jostled back onto the main line and it was on its way again to the destination, with the children being gently rocked in their beds. The next morning they were awakened, surprised at how bright it was at that point in the morning. They were being told to get up and get dressed, for they had arrived in Montreal. So they got up, brushed their teeth, got all ready, gathered their items, and exited the train. Outside of the train, there was a row of taxis ready for the students. When the students turned around, they saw that there was only their 2 cars. The rest of the passenger train had uncoupled and been on its way. The train crew did not want to disturb the students because they had arrived in Montreal in the middle of the night. So rather than wake them at 3 a.m., they allowed the students to sleep until about 6:30. So the students got out of the train, into the row of taxis, and went off to the School for the Deaf in Montreal, known as the Mackay Institution. And so for 15 years, those Alberta students commuted to the School for the Deaf in Montreal. Those who were young grew in intelligence over that time frame. They acquired their math and numeracy skills. They learned the names of the cities across Canada. They became very inventive. They passed time playing games, doing their chores. Some passed time reading, thereby acquiring English literacy. Other times they passed the time playing the color game, where they learned their language from each other. Those students grew to be mature, responsible people ready for post-secondary education.